It can be quite difficult, especially as self-taught pianists, to know exactly what to do when you're learning. And so last week I put out a community post asking my subscribers if they had any questions, and I was not expecting to get quite so many responses. So in today's video, I'm going to try and get through as many of them as I can. So let's get into it. Now, I have tried to group some of these together where the questions were fairly similar. So firstly, we have Matt, can you cover arpeggios and how to make them fast and even, how to practice them? And similarly, we have, hey Matthew, what would be the best way to learn and practice arpeggios? I really appreciate your content. Thank you. Thank you. And we have, could you share some suggestions for building up speed in fast scale passages? I am an adult intermediate pianist, currently without a teacher. I'm starting to encounter more pieces with long, fast scale passages, and I'm having a terrible time trying to keep the notes even once the tempo increases past about 100 beats per minute for 16th note passages. Do you have any suggestions for how to practice these runs, specifically when trying to build speed? Now, I've grouped these together because they are all asking questions about playing fast technical patterns, so arpeggios and scales. And there are several things that you can do if you come across a scale section that's supposed to be fast in a piece, or an arpeggio, or you're just generally trying to get faster at playing scales and arpeggios. The first thing I would say is to try and practice in short bursts. A lot of people will rightly practice longer sections of scales or arpeggios quite slow, like this. And that is a very good thing to do because it means you're more likely to be accurate and you can focus on exactly how you're playing the scale or the arpeggio or the section of a piece of music. However, if you want to get quicker, you need to play quicker. The reason why a lot of people don't advise playing quickly is because you are more likely to make mistakes. And the way to get around that is to play in short sections. So there are really two ways of practicing. You can practice large sections slowly, or you can practice small sections quickly. And that is exactly what I would advise doing in this situation. So for a scale, you might play the first 4 notes of a scale, but try and play it very quickly and accurately. If you're playing an arpeggio, you might play the first 4 notes of an arpeggio, making sure that you get your thumb under in time to the right note. Then you can start adding more of the scale or the arpeggio onto the end of that. And it's the same with pieces. If you have a section of a piece of music that's really fast and difficult, and there's quite a lot of it, so there might be 2 bars of really fast technical notes, then maybe practice all of that section really slowly, but at the same time practice the first 4, 5, 6 notes really quickly and try and add to it. So you're doing both types of practice. The second thing I would suggest for practicing quick scales and arpeggios specifically is to practice 1 note beyond finger crossings. And by that I mean, if you are playing a scale, the first 3 notes are usually fingers 1, 2, and 3, and then you put your thumb under to play the next note if you're playing a normal C major scale, for example. If you practice the first 3 notes, they are just consecutive fingers. The actual challenging part of scales is where your thumbs are having to go under, or your 3rd and 4th fingers are having to go over the top. So I would always practice 1 note beyond where your fingers got to change over, so that you get used to where those finger crossings are at speed. And that is the same for arpeggios. So you might practice the first 4 notes to practice the right hand finger crossing, and then you might practice the first 5 notes to practice the left hand finger crossing. The third thing that I would suggest for if you are learning a piece with a fast section in it is to try and make fun exercises out of it. If you're practicing arpeggios specifically, I refer to my video on technical exercises because the 3rd and 4th exercises in that video were fun arpeggio exercises, or at least I think they're fun. But if you have a challenging part of a piece, then you can isolate that part of the piece and turn that into a technical exercise. Okay, the next question is from Tim, who is a channel member, and his playing actually featured in one of my recent members' videos. Just a quick interlude from Future Matt to let you know that every week I also produce videos reacting to my subscribers' piano playing for members of the channel. So if you are interested in learning a lot more about music, then feel free to support the channel and become a member for some extra content. Okay, back to the video. Hey Matthew, I know one of your accomplishments that you have made is winning a Beethoven Sonata competition. I would love to know how you managed to do it. Do you have any tips for pianists entering a Beethoven Sonata competition, and are there techniques which increase your chances of getting a higher place? So firstly, for Beethoven specifically, you cannot really over-exaggerate dynamics and contrast within the piece. Beethoven was in the transitional period between the classical and romantic periods of music, and he was one of the first composers to break out of these really refined and controlled pieces of music and cared more about the expression of the piece of music. And so if you see a dynamic in a Beethoven piece that says forte, that means something very different to if you see a forte dynamic in a piece by Mozart or Haydn or anyone else that was earlier. The second thing that I would say that applies to any competition based around any composer's works is that you are trying to create a story. You really need to understand the piece and try and tell that story. And a good place to start with doing that is by trying to work out how that piece relates to the composer's life. So what period of their life did they write that piece of music? Was it written for anyone? Was it written with a particular emotion in mind? With Beethoven's sonatas, one of the biggest key features that people like to incorporate in their music is at what period of deafness was Beethoven in? And also, how mature is he? For example, in his later sonatas, you can almost hear the age of Beethoven within the music. In his earlier sonatas, they're quite a lot more playful, and they feel a lot more authoritative and young in spirit. Or that's my impression, at least. But then within the music, you've got to almost try and create a story for yourself. For example, in the Sonata Pathétique, which is a very popular piece to play, the entire opening of the first movement of that piece is in stark contrast to the rest of the first movement. And why is that? What story is Beethoven trying to tell with that opening section compared to the more furious second part to that movement? And because of this, I would also suggest sectioning the music into themes. In sonatas specifically, you often get sonata form, which means it has very clear sections within the piece of music. And I would practice the piece in those sections so you can really embody the emotion that that section is trying to create. If there is a section of the music that is particularly quiet and tame, then it's good to practice that so that you can encompass that emotion as you're practicing that section. And then if there's a more furious section, you can also embody that while you're practicing that section. Then when you put the sections together, you can almost switch your persona as you go from one to the other because you've practiced them in those clear, distinct sections. Okay, what differentiates the world-class pianist versus the extremely advanced or talented pianist? Is talent and hard work not enough? And there was another question that said, "Good day, Matthew. I have a rather technical question on my mind. I've been playing the piano for around 4 years despite practicing almost every day. It seems there is a skill ceiling I hear, which I just can't get over. More specifically, I see others using simple techniques like scale runs and arpeggios, trills and tremolos so effortlessly. You know what I mean. And despite studying a lot about these techniques, I still find it difficult to execute them consistently. So my question is, what do you think differentiates the technical skill level of an amateur to a professional?" So both of these questions are essentially asking what is the difference between a professional pianist and a good or talented amateur pianist. For an amateur pianist, often the technique and the execution of a piece is the end goal. That is the thing that they're aiming to do. Whereas for a professional pianist, what they care about is conveying the intended emotion, and then technique and accuracy aids that. By doing that, it actually makes it a lot easier for professional pianists to sit and practice for hours and hours, because they won't sit there and practice an arpeggio just to try and get it right. They will sit there and practice an arpeggio with a specific intention of the type of sound they're trying to create. And if you add that approach to practice up over the entire piece of music that they're learning, the result is going to be very, very different. Now, to me, there is no such thing as talent. I think there are unfair advantages. So I think people have a different starting point and people have different natural abilities, but that does not encompass the entirety of learning the piano. Someone might be naturally very good with their ears, but they might be really terrible at sight reading. Or someone might be able to naturally pick up sight reading, but not be able to coordinate their fingers very well. Everyone has things that they're naturally good at and that they're naturally not so good at. And what makes someone very, very good at the piano is leaning into the things that they're not very naturally good at. So if you are not natural at reading music, then you need to do a lot more of reading music. And once again, this is kind of a mindset thing. So even for professionals, it's never going to be 100% easy. Essentially what I'm saying is, don't focus on the skill level that you are at and the skill level someone else is at. Focus on how well you can play and translate the specific piece you are learning. Okay, how do you know what fingers to use when sight reading? And another question said, when playing piano, how do I know what fingers or techniques to use? I find myself doing a lot of awkward movements that cause me tension. And how do you release tension or practice playing without tension? So for fingers when sight reading specifically, there is no set fingers. And I do think a lot of people think there is a very specific way that you have to play the piano. And there actually isn't. There are common things to do, and this is exactly why we practice scales and arpeggios, because those are the common finger patterns that you're going to come across in pieces. So if you recognize an arpeggio within a piece of music, then you're probably going to use the fingers you've practiced when practicing arpeggios, and the same for scales. However, for sight reading specifically, you can't really prepare the fingers that you're going to use in advance. All you can do is glance ahead slightly and see the highest note that you need and the lowest note that you need, roughly, and try and make sure that you've got enough fingers left in order to be able to play those notes. Having said that, a lot of the things that you see within a piece of music are conventional patterns, so most of music is made up from scales and arpeggios, so most of the fingers should already be kind of obvious. If you've practiced enough scales and arpeggios, if you know all of your arpeggios and all of your scales, there's going to be very little that comes up in a piece of music where you don't know which fingers to use. And with regards to tension, what I would say is try not to force any unnatural fingers. If something doesn't feel right, then the chances are it's not right. If you are finding that you're having to do any awkward movements or stretches that don't feel comfortable or anything like that, I would go back a little bit and see if you can work out which fingers will get you there in the most conventional way. If you do this enough, then you'll find natural fingers. But if you are finding tension, then stop and shake your hand out. Okay, next question. How can I use advanced chords like sevenths, dominant, augmented, or sus chords in song covers? And there was another question that said, I can play most songs by ear and can find the diatonic chords too, but struggle with the special chords like the sevenths, susses, or others. And there was one more question that said, I sing and compose, but classical, basically 3 triad chords. I would love to learn jazz and gospel, and I'm just not familiar with sevenths, nines, 13ths in music. So this is essentially about playing chord extensions or added notes to regular triads. Now, a triad is when you play every other note in a scale. So, for example, in a C major scale, the notes in a C major scale are C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, and you can play a triad by playing C, E, and G, which is every other note in the scale. This is chord 1 in the key of C major. Chord 2 would be a D chord, chord 3 would be an E chord, chord 4 an F chord, chord 5, a G chord, chord 6 is an A chord, and chord 7 would be a B chord. And for most music, these are the chords that are going to be used whenever you're using that specific scale in a song or a piece of music. But you can add notes to these chords, and these are the added notes that these questions are referring to. So for sevenths, for example, you can play a triad, and a seventh would be where you play note 1, 3, 5, and 7. So you're kind of adding another extra note to the chord. If you want to know more about chords or how to make chords, then I do have a few videos on that. So I definitely advise checking those out if you haven't done already. But the easiest way to start using these chords is to start with the basic triad and pick one way in which you add the notes. So for a seventh chord, for example, I might choose to add the note just below the triad. And if I remember this specific shape on the piano, then I can use this for every chord. If you have this one shape that you remember that is not that different to just a normal triad shape, then you can start throwing these in just by adding that extra note. So for example, if I have a chord sequence that is chord 1, chord 4, chord 3, chord 5, I can experiment with adding that note to some of these chords. So essentially you want to think of the triad first, think of where you're going to go in terms of which chord you're going to use, and then just try and throw in the note that alters the chord as a little bit of an afterthought. If you do this enough, you'll get very, very accustomed at playing that specific shape on the piano, and then you can start accumulating shapes that you play, and eventually you'll kind of have unlimited shapes because you'll be so comfortable with the notes in the chords. And I can almost guarantee that that's probably how the Beatles did it, because the Beatles were known for not being very musically theoretical. They just kind of played things that they thought sounded good. So no doubt Paul McCartney will have sat at the piano and played a couple of chords and then thrown in some extra notes to simple chords that he knew. Okay, is it worth it to get a degree in something music related? Now, I will always give my honest opinion, and to me the answer is no. If you do want to become something like a school teacher, which requires a degree in the subjects that you're going to be teaching, then yes. Or if you want to build connections with like-minded people who are doing exactly the same thing as you, then that is another great reason to go and get a degree in music or something music-related. However, for most musicians, a lot of the work that you're going to be doing, if you do go into music as a career, doesn't require a degree in order to do that. For example, I have been privately teaching the piano since I was 15 years old, and I definitely didn't have a degree when I was 15. And going to study the piano and get a degree in piano performance hasn't been required for anything that I have ever done. As a professional pianist and performer, it's more based on your reputation than anything else. So I would definitely go and get a degree if you want to go for connections, or if you need the degree to work in a school or something like that. Other than that, if you want to keep progressing, you'll progress much faster by saving the money and spending it on a private teacher teacher over the same 3, 4, 5-year period. Hey, I just got a piano for my birthday last week and have no prior experience playing. I know it's not recommended to learn advanced pieces as a beginner, but I really want to learn Moonlight Sonata Movement 3, and I'm wondering if technique will be a problem. If so, how do you recommend I learn the correct technique without developing bad habits? I am determined to learn this piece even if it takes thousands of hours. Okay, the fastest way to learn Moonlight Sonata if you are an absolute beginner at learning the piano is by learning other pieces. Moonlight Sonata Movement 3 requires techniques that are best learned through other pieces that use those techniques. For example, in Moonlight Sonata specifically, one of the main techniques is something called broken chords. Now, there are other pieces that use broken chords in a much more simpler way, which will help you learn that technique much quicker than if you were trying to just practice the Moonlight Sonata. Ultimately, learning the Moonlight Sonata as the first thing that you do isn't going to teach you the piano. It's a bit like me learning the phrase, "Can I have 2 beers and some fries?" in French. I don't really know what the French words mean. I can't speak the French language, and my pronunciation of that sentence is probably going to be pretty bad. So if I actually wanted to learn French, I'm better off learning how the language works, how to construct sentences, and then putting those together to make that same sentence. And you would do that by learning the words in other contexts that are much more simple. For example, I might learn how to say the word two in French, which is de and de. Really bad pronunciation. And if I learn the words for the numbers 1 to 10, then I can even ask for 3 beers. And instead of beers, I might want a white wine. So I might learn how to say that in French as well. And then I can piece this sentence together to say any number of different things that I want. And this is exactly the same with Moonlight Sonata. If you learn Moonlight Sonata, you are just learning a sentence that doesn't make any sense. And the pronunciation of that piece is probably going to be pretty bad. And it would take you a long time to make it sound good. Whereas if you learn how the piece is constructed using much simpler context, then you would actually get to learn Moonlight Sonata much better and quicker. Maybe not the answer that you wanted, but the answer that you need. How should I learn to compose if I have musical ideas I like? How do I learn the theory to add to it? So for this, the theory that you're going to need is all going to be scales and chords. If you understand all the major and minor scales, and you understand the chords that can be used within those scales, then if you come up with a melodic idea, for example, on the piano, you find a melody that you really like, you can work out what scale that belongs to, and therefore you'll know which chords will work well with that melody. Or if you come up with a chord sequence, you can work out which scale those chords belong to and come up with a melody using that scale. So if you don't know anything about theory, but you can just come up with a tune that you like, I would first learn about scales and then which chords those scales belong to, and that will unlock a lot of different avenues for you. Okay, how do you play a melody with octaves in the right hand? I especially mean when they are big jumps. I always tend to miss octaves and play major sevenths instead, or other intervals. Another question said, "Hello Matthew, I'm a self-taught pianist who is currently studying the fundamentals of classical piano technique and ethics. I've been playing the piano for 2 years and I think I have good progress. Now I was really wondering on how to work on high leaps and jumps because I'm learning Anamenz's Unravel. Currently I tried legato slow, practicing the wall part, which I understand, but I don't know how to actually play it fast in legato. And in the chorus of Divinir by Einaudi, is there a secret technique of some sort that makes you hit the right notes at such speed?" So these 3 questions are kind of about moving around on the piano accurately and jumping around. Now, as you learn the piano, you do build muscle memory as to where you are going on the piano. So eventually your hand does remember the distance of an octave, for example. And if you are jumping from octave to octave, eventually it'll be quite easy to hit the right notes. But how do you actually get there? Well, a good exercise that you can try in order to start building up that muscle memory is to play an octave on the piano and then substitute the thumb for the little finger and play the little finger at the top like this. And you can do this slow like that and then build up the speed. This does a couple of things. First of all, it means that you're having to move your hand inwards. So you're having to lose the shape of the octave and then re-find it again. Every time you have to re-find an octave distance, it's going to build up that familiarity in your hand of how far your hand needs to spread apart. The second thing that this does is it moves you from one octave to the next, so you're starting to feel the distance that your arm is having to move up to the next octave. One of the things that I see a lot of people doing when they're having to jump around playing octaves is they tend to tense up in order to try and keep the same shape on the piano, but by practicing this particular technique, you get used to being able to relax your hand, move it inwards, and then re-find the octave. And I would practice this as a scale, just so that it's not completely boring, and you might as well learn scales while you're doing it. Over time, once you practice that enough, you can remove the substitute note, and you can just jump the octave, and you should find that it's a lot easier to get there. And as with some of my previous answers, I would also say if you come across this in a piece, then practice either long and slow, so play the octave jumps really slowly as part of a wider context, or play them short and fast. So see if you can play a really small section that includes one of those jumps at a much quicker speed, because by doing that you're isolating the problem. Okay, how long does it really take to learn and perfect a piece if you are a professional? I can't imagine that it really takes 3 months or more to learn a piece like Moonlight Sonata Third Movement. Very popular piece today, because if that were the case, you could only learn a handful of piano pieces like that in your life. But if you look at YouTubers like Cassia or Russo, for example, who have uploaded almost 100 such pieces in a few years, I can hardly imagine that it takes as long as some pianists here on YouTube and outside of YouTube say. And why? Okay, firstly, most pianists have a massive catalogue of pieces that they've played over their entire lifetimes. I have a personal catalogue of pieces that I've played, and these pianists being referred to here, so Cassia and Russo, will have done that too, although I believe Russo may be more than one pianist. When you see them upload pieces like this to YouTube, this is not often them practicing for 3 months to learn that piece. Now, it's a piece that they've learned 10 years ago, and then they've brushed it up to then play it for YouTube. And for most professional pianists that go through music college, for example, it's a very intensive time where you do learn a lot of pieces in a short period of time, and those pieces become pieces that you're going to play for the rest of your life. So all that is to say that when they first learned them, yes, it will have taken them more time than you think to really nail that piece, but now they don't have to do all of that work again because they already have a deep understanding of the piece. They've just got to brush up on the physical technique of it. The second thing that I would say is that for actual professional pianists, this is from my point of view anyway, but pieces that I learn now do take a lot less time than they once did. Now, it wouldn't take me anywhere near as long in order to learn a Beethoven sonata. I could probably do it if I needed to in 3 to 4 weeks. And that is because a lot of the things that I'm going to see in a Beethoven sonata now I've already seen before. So in new pieces of music, professional pianists only have to learn the things that they haven't really practiced specifically to that piece. Most techniques and ways of writing they will have seen lots of times before. And on top of that, they have a large catalogue of probably the most famous pieces in their back pocket, ready to go for a performance, a recital, or a YouTube video. How long is the process of building good technique? So this is an interesting question, because what is good technique? I would say that good technique is the absence of bad technique. There is much more than one way of playing something correctly, and technique can be a somewhat moving target. So every time that you ever learn a new piece, there are going to be techniques within that piece that require learning. For example, if you have had tension in your hands before, you know that tension is caused by bad technique, so you learn how to get rid of tension. Now, that doesn't mean you're never going to have tension in your hands again. You may come across a piece that requires something quick, and you may find that in that specific situation, you get tension in your hand again, even though generally, as a player, you don't have tension in your hands. It just means that in that situation, there is something that's technically challenging that you need to learn, and you get good at learning how to learn and how to fix that technical problem. Now, if you take that all the way back down to a beginner pianist, it's not that a beginner pianist has bad technique, it's just that they don't know how to fix technical problems yet, because essentially everything you come across is a technical problem. If you asked a question and I didn't get to it, then I do apologise, there was a lot of them. And if you want to understand how to understand a piece of music that you're reading, then head on through and I will see you there.